Welcome to this IFA GAROP webinar, the first in a series in preparation for the 11th session of the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging. My name is Andres Tanku, Project Officer with the International Federation on Aging, and we'll briefly review housekeeping. This webinar features remarks from expert speakers, which will be introduced shortly. Speaker biographies will be posted in the chat box, and please feel welcome to share comments and resources there as well. Following the speaker interventions, there will be a moderated discussion. Please post any questions for the speakers in the question and answer box, and that is a separate function to the chat box. The webinar is recorded and will be posted on the IFA YouTube channel and on the GAROP website, along with relevant resources and information about the next webinar in the series. It is now my great pleasure to pass the floor to the moderator of today's webinar, the chair of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Older People, Dr. Kiran Rabheru. And please unmute.
Thank you very much, Andra, for organizing this webinar series for GAROP. And I would like to take this opportunity to welcome each and every one of you to the webinar, which is the first one of a series of two. This one is titled Time for a UN Convention on the Rights of Older People. It's organized by the Global Alliance for the Rights of Older People in partnership with the International Federation on Aging. This is the latest in our series of webinars to support civil society organizations to engage with the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Aging process, including advocating for, with your governments and other stakeholders, and strengthening your own direct participation and contributions. As Andra said, my name is Dr. Kiran Rabheru, and I'm chair of the Global Alliance of the steering group of the Global Alliance on the Rights of Older People, and I will be moderating the session today. It has been 2 years since the Open-Ended Working Group on Aging met in person in New York, and the one last year, the 11th session, was postponed due to the pandemic. The Open-Ended Working Group session is such a crucial opportunity for older people to discuss their rights and the need for a new UN convention. We are committed to supporting effective engagement of older people as well as civil society in this process, which has been postponed to this March and April. And we'll hear more about the upcoming session. We're mobilizing and supporting our members now to carry out crucial national advocacy work and to organize through their own various global working groups. We are privileged to have with us today a very impressive lineup of speakers who I will introduce in turn a little bit later. As Andra said, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, as this is the function that I will be monitoring as your moderator today. Please also note that, as Andra said already, that this will be recorded and it will be available on IFA's YouTube channel, the Global Alliance website, and I believe also on one of the UN websites, which Amal will tell us about. So without further ado, I'm going to now introduce you to the first speaker. And many of you probably already know all three speakers. They're, as I said, they're very prominent people in our field. So the first speaker is Amal Abou-Rafey. Amal is the Chief of Program on Aging at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs in New York. She serves on the Secretariat of the General Assembly's Working Group for the purpose of strengthening the protection of human rights of older persons. Amal is a member of the steering group of the Titchfield City Group on Aging-related statistics and age disaggregated data. She's also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Healthy Aging and Longevity from 2020 to 21. Her full bio is on the web, it's been posted, so I'm not going to take up much time to go into that. Amal, please take the floor.
Thank you so much for the invite, Dr. Kiran. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to give a shout out to Ellen and Andra, who work tirelessly behind the scenes to make these events possible and seamless. Can we please upload the presentation, Andra? Thank you. So we have confirmed the dates for the 11th session. They're from the 29th of March and to, believe it or not, April Fools. But before we get started discussing the session, and because it's been a while, I think it's important to make sure first that we're all on the same page. You know, when I first joined the aging team many years ago and I attended the working group, I recall listening to our OHCHR colleague, Mr. Craig Mkhayber, talk about the rights of older persons. I recall he used the words dignity, core values, moral integrity. I also recall rolling my eyes when he said those. You see, I decided to take a parallel path, to move beyond the ethical perspective and incorporate social and economic aspects that show decision makers that investing in older people is a smart investment. In our latest Secretary General report, we zoomed in on older people and the future of work. We presented figures and evidence on the participation of older workers in labor markets, in the informal economy, in entrepreneurship, in the GDP of countries. And throughout last year, as I shared this info on virtual meetings, the body language reactions of the audience was mind-blowing. Those who were looking down looked up at their screen. Those who were looking at the screen leaned in. And instead of feeling happy, I was overwhelmed by an unpleasant feeling. The first thought that came to my mind was, wow, do we have to slap a dollar bill on older people to show decision makers that they're worthy? And how can we ignore what we've all heard, seen, and experienced in the past year throughout the pandemic with the fear and suffering and isolation that older people have been experiencing, the horrors from the nursing home stories, the decisions on the use of the scarce medical resources when it came to critical decisions of life and death, and how many older people were neglected and in some cases sacrificed for younger age groups. Make no mistake, Craig was right. This is an issue of dignity, of core values, of moral integrity. It's about who we are as human beings and how we want to treat each other as we age. And at the core of this conversation is human rights. And our work on the rights of older people cannot and should not look the same after this crisis. Next slide, please. The Secretary General himself leaned into this conversation. Let me be clear, we briefed him on the politics that surround this highlighted text, but his message was direct. He used the convention not in the text of the document, but under recommendations and solutions. He used the word accelerate as if to say, come on, let's get to this. And he tapped into a resolution that called on this working group to come up with, at the earliest possible date, elements that go into a convention, a call that was made 8 years ago. Next slide, please. Last month, the UN launched a pretty high-profile report. It captured the results of a massive global conversation that the Secretary General had launched on how to shape our future together. Now, older people were mentioned only twice in that document. And in one of those mentions that's highlighted here was a result on an analysis of 1,200 dialogue summaries submitted from 94 countries, where the convention was highlighted. And as my colleague Rio told me, this is particularly powerful because it reflects people's priorities for the future and their ideas for action. Next, please. So where were we last? Yeah, this was our website at the time. Lots of red font there saying that things are canceled and postponed. And since then, we have news and no news. So next slide, please. We have a new chair designate. That's Ambassador Maria del Carmen Scaf of Argentina. Next slide, please. We have no news to share with you as of yet on the intergovernmentally negotiated recommendations. that this group is supposed to consider and adopt and then present to the General Assembly. Next slide, please. So before I get into what you've asked me to talk about, which is what the 11th session will look like, I want to let you know that my team and I had some time to kill. So we looked at the inputs that came into the sessions from the 8th session through the 11th. I think the 4 sessions that we had a call for inputs. We broke them down by stakeholder and by region. And I'm sharing this with you so that you can look at the NGO inputs. I mean, look at that graph. I wanted to let you know that you really ought to give yourselves a pat on the back because there was a lot of energy behind this that drove this. And I also want to let you know that I've shared these graphs with the members of the Bureau so that they are mindful of the hard work that civil society undertakes throughout the year, not just at the session itself in New York, and how much of that work goes in at the country level. Next slide, please. All right. Unfortunately, I have no final answers as of yet. Everything I say today is to be confirmed. Let me tell you, these are uncharted territories preparing for this session. For the past months, we've been coming up with proposals, addressing concerns, mitigating risks. The closest that I can describe it to you all is like finalizing seating arrangements at a very big wedding. It's really, yeah, it's really something. So what I can say is that part of this session will definitely be in person so that member states can complete the procedural segments of the working group. Part of it may be hybrid, and other parts of it will certainly be only virtual. As far as NGOs and NHRIs are concerned, your mode of participation will be virtual. Don't let your colleagues that are based in New York with passes to the UN complex tease you that they can walk in. They won't. Even Craig, myself, and our teams will be participating virtually in this session. And because the majority of you will likely be participating by viewing the webcast of proceedings, I've decided to cancel online registration. It makes no sense and it's a waste of my time and your time. So there will be no online registration this year. Now, to be confirmed, you may hear soon from us and from OHCHR asking you and NHRI colleagues to pre-select amongst yourselves a handful of representatives who will have the opportunity to intervene at the session. That's why I'm telling you, please be prepared because this will require internal discussions and collaboration at your end. I know we haven't done this exercise before. I know it won't be perfect. I know there'll be a lot of complaints, but like everything that presents itself to us in life, you know, we make the best out of what we have. My next big message to you is do your homework. You know, my gut feeling is that you'll probably get a combination of ways to contribute to the session, be it written statements, pre-recorded videos, or that hand-selected few who'll be able to participate in the virtual panel discussions. I've highlighted the 7 entry points which you can use to make those interventions and contributions. If we do end up calling for written statements, I want to let you know that this is the proxy that I'm going to use to measure NGO and NHRI participation. So please keep that in mind. Also, I really encourage you, to use this opportunity that things are virtual and restricted in timing by going to the working documents in which we've analyzed the inputs. 2 already posted, 1 will be posted soon, definitely before the end of this month, and use that as a springboard to deliver your messages. And let's use this opportunity to really raise the bar on the quality and the substance of the conversations. Listen, I'm not a human rights expert, and if I understand everything that's being discussed at the working group, that means that we're not on target. It's not human rightsy enough. And I know human rightsy isn't a word, but that's why we have Craig with us today to explain what that means. Next slide, please. So finally, the last 2 points I want to make is the issue of the panel experts and the side events, because it's been so long since you and member states have nominated panel experts. The Bureau agreed to renew the call. I have here all the information that you will need. Please share it with us. unfortunately, due to the restrictions posed by interpreters, and it's also understandable because of time management restrictions, panel discussions, anything that involves virtual interactive dialogue for anything intergovernmental in New York shrinks from 3 hours to 2 hours. So we'll have a smaller number of panel experts. So you may not necessarily get the people you nominate, but definitely exercise your right to nominate them. We will share them with the Bureau members. And finally, side events, yep, we'll hold them. I think this is an opportunity for you to use them to get your messages across. They will all be virtual, and we'll set up the online application soon for people to sign up. So thank you so much, Dr. Kiran. That's all I have from my end, and happy to take questions later if there are any.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amal. Thanks for giving us that overview and the update of the work that the open-ended working group, including the status of the, perhaps someone can mute wherever that, okay, thank you. And thanks, Amal, for updating us on the work that has already happened and what we can anticipate coming up in the future in the next few weeks. I would really encourage all of the participants to start thinking about the questions or comments that they would like to make, and especially to the panelists today, and post them on the Q&A. There's one question there, but I'm hoping that there'll be a lot more interactivity during, you know, virtual platforms are difficult because you're not all in the room. And, but I'm pretending like you're all in the room with us today. And so I'd like you to feel the same way so that you know, we can remove the barriers of the virtual platform completely. Just pretend you're in the room with us, okay? Next, I'd like to call upon Craig Ohchr. Bless you. For many people, Craig needs no introduction, and you told me to just use one sentence to introduce him. I find it really difficult to find one sentence in the bio. So Craig, forgive me, I may go a little longer than the one sentence. So Craig is an international lawyer, and he specializes in human rights law, policy, and methodology. He has spent 4 decades in the international human rights movement, including more than 27 years at the UN. He's currently the director of the New York office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and he's held senior UN positions in Geneva, New York, and in the field, has undertaken human rights missions to dozens of countries across many continents: Africa, Asia, Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. He really knows human rights. He lives and breathes it. He has served as the UN Senior Human Rights Advisor in Palestine, in Afghanistan. He has led the team of human rights specialists attached to the high-level mission on Darfur, headed the Rule of Law and Democracy Unit, and served as chief of the Economic and Social Issues section, and chief of the Development and Economic and Social Issues branch of the OHCHR headquarters. I can go on for much longer, and I won't, because I'm taking up his time to speak. So without further ado, Craig, please, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kiran. Isn't that always the way that as soon as I unmute, I start choking on my tea? So I'm sorry for that, but let's see if we can get through this. Really grateful to be invited to be a part of this conversation with you today, Kiran, and Andranella and everybody else who's been involved. And so nice to be able to follow my colleague Amal, who's been such an amazing agent of progress, not just on this issue, but on a whole range of issues within the United Nations. So really grateful for being a part of it as well. But I just really have one message today, which is really that it's time. You know, 10 years into this enterprise, we still have a lot of folks who have been reticent about moving forward and following the advice of the Secretary General to really expedite action on the adoption of a new international legal instrument on the protection of the human rights of older persons. And you have to believe that after the year that we've just lived through, where we've seen a curtain pulled back on a second pandemic, if I can call it that, driven by a global virus of ageism, age discrimination, vulnerability, neglect, abuse, you know, that this is the moment at which if folks aren't going to see it now, they're not going to see it at all. And we have to insist that they do. Really, across the globe, older persons, their rights, their actual lives have been the first victims of COVID-19, of this pandemic. If you measure it by infections, if you measure it by serious illness, if you measure it by deaths, it's older persons who have really been most ravaged by this pandemic. We've seen in the reporting that we get gross negligence turning nursing homes and care facilities into killing grounds. We've seen some countries adopting vaccine distribution plans that only cover people under the age of 60. So that's like a Western country adopting an anti-racial discrimination law that only covers white people. I mean, these kinds of things are absolutely what the international human rights movement has been warning about for all of these years. We've seen public positions taken by politicians and public health officials in some countries openly talking effectively about sacrificing older persons and migrants, by the way, in so-called herd immunity strategies to benefit younger persons and citizens. How did this happen? How did we get here? This is the question. And we really think that a part of this flows from the original sin of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The cornerstone of the entire international human rights law edifice, the entire international human rights movement. It was an amazing document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 30 articles, dealing with all aspects of human rights, all of the building blocks of a new order of freedom from fear and freedom from want, but not a word about discrimination on the basis of age. A really remarkable omission. It explicitly prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, language, religion, political, other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status, but not a word about age. And when you think that it was the Universal Declaration that was the basis for all the subsequent instruments adopted, treaties and so on in the international human rights regime, you realize how that original sin has continued to affect the situation of older persons even today. It means that very little attention, relatively speaking, has been given to the human rights of older persons by international human rights monitors, international human rights mechanisms. And now there's a lot of reason to believe that this is the moment at which we can hope that that gap, which has existed since 1948, will finally be filled. First, because the human life cycle is changing, obviously. People are living longer, they're working longer, creating longer, participating longer in society, marrying later, having children later, retiring later. Second, because older persons are a growing constituency, already large, but we know that by 2045, for the first time in human history, older persons will be more than children, there'll be more older persons than children in the world. By 2050, they'll represent a fifth of the global population. Third, we know from our monitoring that this constituency is increasingly subjected to a broad range of violations of their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, perpetrated against them because they are older persons. Ageism, age discrimination, exclusion, deprivation, abuse. We've seen it all. This includes institutional neglect and abuse, denial of work, social security, healthcare, other essential services, denial of a voice in political processes, targeting by con artists and violent criminals, and interference in their own autonomous decisions about their personal finance, property, housing, and medical care. And then finally, Kiran, in terms of justification, the yawning gaps, really huge gaps in regulatory, policy, programmatic, and legal frameworks, both at the national and the international level, have left older persons without adequate protection, redress, or power. So you have this broad range of treaties now that protects all other groups from discrimination, but no international convention on the human rights of older persons. This makes older persons invisible in international protection. And there's a growing body of evidence that suggests in countries across the world, aging is becoming an experience marked by vulnerability, exclusion, abuse, discrimination, and deprivation. We've seen even in countries where indicators of racism are declining, indicators of ageism are increasing. And in the absence of international standards and the face of low or sometimes non-existent national standards, we've seen shocking cases of institutional neglect and abuse of seniors. And the COVID pandemic, again, has revealed that for everybody to see. Public policy at the national level is lagging behind, and many in this disempowered group lack a political voice. There are gaps in standards. Older persons are not addressed by the international instruments. Some of these are in areas relating to legal capacity, legal planning, equality before the law, especially people subjected to various forms of guardianship. Similar problems with long-term and institutional care. We've heard all of these heartbreaking stories of older persons being denied care or exposed to diseases like COVID, or forced to live in unsanitary conditions, or subjected to physical abuse, or sequestered against their will and exploited financially and otherwise. The problem here is not an absence of resources to protect older persons, but a problem of an absence of standards and of enforcement. And while we have an international framework to protect children and women and other groups from violence, there is nothing to protect older persons from violence at the international level. There are other gaps as well that I'll just quickly mention. Issues that are at the heart of the aging experience, like mandatory retirement, access to productive resources, political and social participation, standards for end-of-life care, palliative care, geriatric health care. All of these lack human rights standards at the international level and often at the national level as well. So remedying these means we have to move to fill these gaps, not with piecemeal approaches, but with a new international human rights treaty on the rights of older persons. This treaty will provide us an opportunity to finally have a comprehensive framework for setting standards everywhere, a single platform for advocacy by all of us, a vehicle for constructive international dialogue and cooperation, an instrument for accountability for the first time. It would also help us to do global monitoring, benchmarking, data collection, disaggregation and reporting, and most importantly, Kiran, and I'll finish here, a convention would catalyze this global paradigm shift that we need now more than ever, away from the failed approaches of charity and the traditional approaches of the past, and toward a recognition of older persons as rights holders, to move away from charity into accountability, away from arbitrariness into the rule of law, and away from pity and into power, which is really the challenge of the day. There is nothing magical that happens when somebody turns 60 or 65 that explains their differential treatment on the basis of age. Only discrimination does, and that discrimination has to end. If we can free all of these gaps, fill all of these gaps, and move away from ageism and age discrimination, we can actually see a future where dignity, as Amal said, is the center of the lives of older persons. We can ensure that the experience of old age is one that celebrates diversity, magnifies the dignity and worth of every human person. But if we're going to get there, that's going to depend on the action that all of us participating in this conversation take now, this year, in the coming weeks, especially. And I hope that everyone is going to make their voice heard on demanding that we move forward on this new convention. I think in the wake of COVID, there is no more room for complacency, no more room for obfuscation or delay. And the future of our society depends on it. As Amal said, our economies depend on it, and the lives and well-being of millions of older persons certainly depend on it. Kiran, I think the curtain has been pulled back, and we have to move now on remedying these horrors and moving toward the adoption of a new convention. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Craig, I have to say, I've heard several people talk about this, but I have never heard someone speak so powerfully and so compellingly to galvanize and to make people move on this issue as I've just heard. So I'm really grateful to you on behalf of every single older person on this earth. I really congratulate you on what you just said. And now the ball is back in our court as civil society and the rest of the sectors that actually work with older people and live with older people to change their hearts and minds and souls of their politicians at the local level, national level, regional level, and hopefully at the open-ended working group. So with that, we'll open the floor up to questions and answers for a short period of time. And then we'll finish up at the end with Vijay, and Vijay has a very powerful talk as well. I'm hoping that people will take some of his tools and be able to apply them at the end. So there's a number of questions, and if you don't mind, I'll start with them. So the first one is from Peggy Edwards, I think. And Peggy, you may have answered this, but she says that a Canadian woman who works in aging and is in her mid-70s said to me, quote, "I think my rights as an older person are no different from anyone else. Why do we need a convention specifically for this age group?" How would you answer that? Either Craig or Amel? I think you.
Sure, I can start. I see Amel waiting to meet. Well, look, we've actually heard those arguments all through the years with regard to women, with regard to minorities, with regard to migrants, with regard to children, with regard to a whole range of categories of persons who you say, well, they have the same rights as everybody else. Why do we need a special convention? They're covered by the Universal Declaration, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. The problem is the lived reality of these groups as groups. And we know that there is a particular lived reality of older persons that relates to, especially to ageism and age discrimination, that needs focused protection to provide all of the kinds of avenues and opportunities that I mentioned in my intervention here. So it is precisely to make sure that the rights that older persons have, like everybody else, are protected from the particular threats to those rights that relate to the experience of being an older person, being a member of that group, of that constituency, which is subjected to a particular form of discrimination. And that has been extremely important for other groups, for example, as I mentioned, like women, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Women who have the same rights as men, nevertheless, have not enjoyed those rights in the same way that men have. And so, so the need for additional protection of the same rights. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kiran. I just wanted to say something really quickly. I think we must be doing something wrong if we still hear older people asking that question, right? The working group has been discussing this for almost a decade now. And this really is great to hear because it helps us sort of reflect and reposition. How are we sending this message out to old people out there, in different countries? And I'm really looking forward to, as many of us are, to the update study that our colleagues at OHCHR are doing to really dig in and offer people and you as advocates and NHRIs like the material, the substance, the meat to support these messaging moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can just add, people just have to look at the reality of how older people have fared over the past year to answer that question. Just that's a reality check. Next question is by Catherine Pettis. Catherine says, terrific presentation, as always, Amal. Thank you for, the issue of unpaid informal caregivers for chronically ill older people at home, predominantly women, intersects with the right to work. How should we frame this as an advocacy ask at the open-ended working group in terms of caregiver allowances?
Thank you so much. I think these should be brought up to the attention of the Bureau of issues that you'd want to dig in further in detail. And I believe that I'm hoping to be confirmed that if you have the opportunity to put in written statements, Kathy, that you put them in there. What I plan on doing is analyzing all the written statements, summarizing them and presenting them to the Bureau, especially on the ways forward. And use the opportunity, as you always do, and we're grateful to you, to hold those side events. Those are really good ways to raise these issues with member states. Thank you.
Thank you, Amel. The next question is for Craig. Craig, this is from Margaret Gillis. What can NGOs do to ensure the rights of older persons are included in the priorities of the OHCHR?
Well, as I think NGOs are doing a lot to make sure that that is happening. 10 years ago, this was barely on the radar of OHCHR. It really was voices of civil society from this movement in particular that sort of forced it onto the agenda. I mean, our human rights monitors and others had, been reporting for years the particular challenges for human rights of older persons, but it was really the civil society groups that that brought it onto the agenda. And I think, the last decade, if you look at the evolution of our relationship with civil society actors on this, it has just been a straight line, straight up. I think working hand in hand with the movement for older persons' human rights. And I would say keep doing what you're doing, make a lot of noise, keep the pressure on, because that's what all bureaucracies respond to. And the UN is no different from any other bureaucracy in that regard. And I think, as I said earlier, I think this is the moment to actually turn up the heat on the UN as well. All aspects of the UN, the departments, the agencies, the intergovernmental bodies, they need to feel the pressure now. This is really our moment. And when you do that, you empower people like Amal inside the organization to push for the changes that need to that need to happen. So I think that's really the answer. And I have to just say also, Margaret, that's at the international level. But one of the things that we have most concerned about is the degree to which pressure is felt at the national level. On national level governments, they need to feel the heat there, so that when they're represented in the open-ended working group, they're coming with a position which is supportive of this initiative. And nobody can do that but civil society.
Right, I'm going to, if I may, just push you a little bit on how do you think, like practically, how should we put more pressure or turn up the heat at the UN to help Amal do her job? And be as specific as you can.
I think you should all send money directly to Amal with greeting cards. If any auditors are watching, that was a joke. I mean, I think, as we said, participating in the open-ended working group massively, which is not just participating in the sessions, and we know that the modalities are still being determined there, but also in engaging with delegations, particularly national delegations that you have a connection with, making sure that you're doing the homework at home as well. So that, because if that pressure doesn't exist, if that demand doesn't exist at the national level, it's unlikely that a delegation is going to be supportive at the international level. So that's the tilling of the ground for what the working group does, is building state by state support for progress on this profile. We need to look for where the obstructions are. We need to try to push through them. We need to build more broadly the state constituency, and our NGOs can do individual bilateral lobbying and engagement on those issues. They can engage directly with the open-ended working group. They can engage in their own capitals, and they can work with us as well inside the UN system, Amal and our office as well. On planning, on side events, on the kinds of things, Kiran, that we're doing right now, thanks to the organization of you and your team. So I think all of that is on the table. And again, I think this year, more than ever, it's needed.
Can I add on to that, please, Kiran? Let's all remember that last year when Bachelet did the video presentation at the working group, it was civil society that brought her. They're the ones who visited her at the office, spoke to her about this, and brought her on board. So definitely agree with Craig that you guys are on the right track. For me, the role of OHCHR, which is what I do, I lean into their expertise. They can give you the information, the details. They've got the experience with other conventions, how they came to be. They have the know-how. You need to do the advocacy work, and they can feed you that information that you need. So do not hesitate to reach out to them for details, for information that help you then pick it up and take it into the advocacy work. And what would help also is to get contact. If you're in certain countries or certain regions, ask who the OHCHR representative is there, so that you can collaborate with them as well on this issue, so that when they deal with governments, they also raise it themselves at the country and regional level. And then finally, and I think this was a question raised in the chat box, you need a champion, right? I mean, I see a lot of progress happening, but there are gaps. I hear what some governments speak in capital, and then when I hear the representative in New York, totally different vibes, right? And from my experience, and Craig, please correct me if I'm mistaken, but when member states want to discuss something or negotiate something, they always have facilitators, usually one from more developed countries, one for more developing countries. They work as the facilitators to bring everybody together. And that's how you overcome the blocks. And that's how you deal with politics. Try as well, in parallel to your advocacy work, to find a country that will champion this. And my advice is not someone from Latin American country. They need help, from some other regions that can sort of balance and really show that this is a global issue. Look at the Secretary General. Once he made that decision clear, I'd like to see which UN agency is going to come up and contradict him, including DESA. No one will. Everybody fell in line. And we're starting to see real examples. Very soon in March, a global report on ageism is going to be issued, signed by the principals of DESA, OHCHR, UNFPA, and WHO together. So having that champion country, I think, will really help overcome these political obstacles. Thank you.
So that's a great segue, Amal. So I don't know if this is a fair question to ask you, and you don't have to answer it, but if you can even suggest which country might be able to do that, or that would be nice. But also, people want to know from both of you, can you give examples of how other conventions have led to practical positive impact and the action steps related to the covered population? Two other related questions is people want to know if you can post your speaking notes and your presentations in some other, they're requesting your presentations. And also if the right to die with dignity would be covered under a new convention. So.
Yes, thanks, Kiran. Yeah, just to start backwards, Craig, I want a copy of your notes as well if you're giving them out. And I think which countries could potentially be champions? Easy. That policy paper of the Secretary General was accompanied by 146 member states that signed up supporting it. Not to compare social groups, but when we do better, I'd like to compare.
Yeah.
That's more member states than those that have signed up supporting the policy brief on persons with disabilities, right? Now, how did that come to be? There was a cross-regional core group that got this moving. Remember, at the time, you know, God bless him, he's doing well, he's in Argentina now, but the Argentinian ambassador, who's an older person, was hospitalized with COVID, right? So there wasn't even an ambassadorial level launching this. It was a cross-regional effort. So look at those lists. You've got Canada, you've got Morocco. I think they're posted online, sorry, I don't have them. You've got, I think, the Philippines, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe Austria. So these are posted online and I'm happy to share them. Those would be wonderful entry points. Also, look at where COVID was a hotspot. Spain, Italy, Canada, you know, these countries that are rich, that do well, that have democracies. And like Craig says, the killing grounds in nursing homes. What do they have to say about this right now? So use these as opportunities to find champions there. And then also very quickly, if I may, before handing over to Craig, I see a question on the intergovernmentally negotiated recommendations. I know you're not happy that I have no news for you. And I strategically chose a picture where there's a glass door that's in focus and in the distance, the room is out of focus because these are intergovernmental closed meetings and we're in no position to share the details there. But in life, usually when I'm confronted with the unknown, I look at scenarios, right? So think about it. What would the best scenario be? That there would be recommendations, that they would be adopted at the working group. And then look at the worst scenario, that there wouldn't be recommendations for this working group. And do your homework. Prepare what are you going to say to this working group if both scenarios happen. And in the best case scenario, what do non-binding recommendations that make suggestions to member states say in a context of a pandemic, in a context where the Secretary General is saying start writing proposals for a convention, in a context where the world is saying, based on the global conversation report, that, you know, push governments to make a convention. Would you be happy with non-binding recommendations? I mean, these are things that you need to discuss and prepare for this session. And I pass it on to Craig. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amal. Craig?
Well, maybe on the issue of other examples of other conventions that have had an impact. Of course, the most recent example is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And it's a really interesting example because you can see the politics of it in many respects mirror the politics of this process. You know, initially, a lot of the same states that were either actively in opposition to the development of a new treaty or, you know, just not on board and not supporting it are the same states that have taken those positions with regard to this initiative for a Convention on the Rights of of older persons. And what changed was the mobilization of civil society. They managed to put enough pressure at home and internationally on states that they would adopt that convention. And that convention has changed the game in very significant ways. You know, these conventions are not just vague recitations of general principles anymore. This is state-of-the-art treaty building where you have very specific obligations that have extremely practical implications. Those treaties, just like the other human rights treaties, are monitored by sitting treaty bodies to which a member state has to report with the participation of civil society periodically, to be engaged in a process where expert bodies check in on what's going on, make recommendations, even help to facilitate support where that's the issue. Whether if the problem is means rather than political will. And that really changes the game. It's been extremely effective in the rights of women on the Women's Convention and the other treaties as well. So, so that we are at that pivot point now that was a few years before the adoption on the rights of persons with disabilities, but we're there now on the older persons. And this is the moment that people have to really push. Will it include a provision on the right to die with dignity? Well, I mean, that's up to what the member states negotiate and the kinds of pressure that's brought to bear by civil society. Right to die as a concept is something which is not universally supported by countries and societies across the world. The right to die with dignity, with the emphasis on dignity, is something that would certainly need to be covered. Issues of end-of-life care, palliative care, geriatric health care, all of those sorts of issues that relate to the final chapter of our lives would absolutely need to be covered in a convention like that. The precise language is something that would have to be negotiated with pressure from civil society.
Thank you very much, Craig. Really great dialogue here. We have a few minutes left, and so we'll try and cover as much as we can. This question is from Erica Dar. She says, Craig, you have often spoken about the issue of development as a human right. In this time of COVID, when member states are struggling toward implementing the SDGs and meeting targets, how would you frame the advocacy around the rights of older persons for member states and development?
Well, so nice to hear from Erica, who's been such a key player in this issue as well. And I would say that, the sort of central core of the SDGs, what made it very different from previous development agendas was this call explicit in the instrument to leave no one behind, a massive focus on equality and non-discrimination, reflected in two separate goals in the agenda, reflected in the horizontal application of these principles, and that includes older persons. That you will not realize the SDGs if you cut out a significant group of society. The bumper sticker, as Erica knows all along, was, leave no one behind it, start with the furthest behind first. And you don't reach any of the goals unless you reach the goals for all of the groups in society. Older persons, because of ageism, because of structural inequalities in society, have a particular challenge in realizing any of the 17 goals that are aligned. And I take the point that somebody said in the chat that older persons, like any group, are not a monolith. Some are better off than others, but the reality of ageism and age discrimination is a reality they're all experience in one way or another. So I think that if we are true to the SDG agenda, we have to be very explicit about all of the groups who are subject to discrimination and may be at risk of being left behind. That idea of leaving people behind was never more stark than it was during this pandemic, when, as I said, we actually heard people speaking publicly about making the choice to leave older persons behind in terms of protection, in terms of investment, in terms of vaccination. So there are no SDGs without older persons, just as there are no SDGs without women and girls and minorities and migrants and others. And we have to make sure that this is a part of the advocacy on the SDGs as well.
And Craig, if I can add on to that as well, if we were to go into a time machine and travel to 2030, right, which is the target for these goals, we know that globally, older people are going to outnumber youth by then. So I hate using demography in the argument. I think if there were just one older person in the world, that older person deserves to live a life of dignity. But that's something for policymakers to also envisage and keep in mind. And it's not only about not leaving older people behind, but it's also about older people actively contributing and participating in delivering on these goals as well. So we're trying our best to kind of go in both parallel paths, because as our colleagues said, and you mentioned in the chat box, that they're not a homogeneous group, right? And when I always ask people, when you think of an older person, who are you imagining? You know, an older person sitting at a bench or someone who's still active. And that's what we try to bring to the attention of member states, and we encourage civil society to also continue, you know, their efforts in promoting these messages. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just getting texts left, right, and center saying this is fantastic. So just to give you some real-time feedback, Amal and Craig and Vijay, I think what we'll do is leave the question and answer now and move on to Vijay's presentation. We'll have time to come back to it at the end. And in the spirit of leaving no one behind, I'm hoping that if there's any questions that we can't answer today, that perhaps we can convene a small session, like just to even try and address them later on in writing after the webinar. Is that okay? All right, perfect. So without further ado, let me quickly introduce Vijay. So Vijay Naraidu is, he's actually helping us very much at GAROP. He's a deputy chair, and he's a member of the steering committee of stakeholders Aging Africa. And he's presently the director of DISMOI Mauritius, and he can tell you more about it in a minute. Vijay holds a postgraduate diploma in planning, management, and evaluation of rural development projects from Pan-African Institute for Development, Kabwe, Zambia. He's a retired senior officer from the Ministry of Education in Mauritius. Again, I'm not going to get too much into his bio. It's posted, but without further ado, please, Vijay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Kiran. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. You know, for quite a number of Fridays, I've been a viewer, a participant in the town hall meetings animated by IFA. So today I feel gratified and honored to be addressing participants on this panel. The question was given to me: what can NGOs do now at national level to advocate for UN Convention on the Rights of Older People? So I've felt that I have to say things that would galvanize opinion from across the globe, and give a new impetus to people who have been advocating for the rights for the convention since some years now. So from today to the 29th of March, we have got a few weeks, which I consider to be critical path, because we have specifically to address our fellow stakeholders. We have to address governments to tell them either to maintain the position that they took favorably at the 10th Open-Ended Working Group, tell them to change their opinion. That is, now, if you had another opinion last time, it was time now to take a firm position in favor of a convention. Now, we ask our respective governments, virtually or physically, because of missions in New York, to participate, to be present, to be vocal, to talk, because it is not, you can't imagine that we have missions who do not participate in such an important, important debates. Now, well, yes, I'd like to talk of the experiences that we have had here in Mauritius. DISMOI. DISMOI is Droit Humain Océan Indien, meaning human rights Indian Ocean, because we have kind of a vision transform, to set up a culture of human rights in the Southwest Indian Ocean region. But now coming back to the local context, we have followed the step-by-step process adopted by we have adopted the FAIR guidelines that HelpAge provided to us. For example, we started by knowing the stakeholders in our environment around us. Started by the Ministry of Social Security, which is the parent ministry for the welfare of older persons. Went around, we found that we have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who gives instructions to our missions in New York in one way or another. We have the National Human Rights Commission, which is an important partner in this landscape of human rights advocates. We have got the Senior Citizens Council, the media people, very important, newspapers, radio stations, TV, because these are the people who would transmit your statements, your opinions, and whatever you've got to see, your reaction to the masses. Then we have academia, because sometimes we felt that, academia, the silence of academia is deafening. So we want them to talk, we want them to speak, we want them to be with us, to support us, NGOs. We've also been to parishes, because there too, they have got an influence with their parishioners. And then trade unions, because trade unions, you know what? They prepare their members for the after retirement. They talk about it. So we've got to talk, to outreach members of trade unions. The University of Third Age. We are fortunate that in Mauritius, we have got a University of Third Age, which I personally joined in order to meet with a larger number of people, a larger audience. We've got sister NGOs, because we do not consider ourselves to have the monopoly, advocating for the rights of people or for the convention. So we have been meeting with sister NGOs, coalition, making a coalition with them year after year, so that we speak as one voice vis-a-vis the government. And then we consider it is very important to go grassroots. I know Margaret will appreciate when I talk about grassroots associations of older persons or women's associations. Now, you know what? We do not talk about human rights of older persons to older persons only. We talk of the rights of older persons with school goers, secondary education students, because when you talk to them, they go home convinced of this principle of the convention. They talk to their parents, and their parents listen to them. The message has come from school, and these students have become members of human rights clubs in the secondary schools that we have initiated in the context of the Republic, in Mauritius, Agalega Island, Rodrigo Island. Now, I'd like to show you when we come to the media. I don't know whether you can see. This is an article that we have written. It's not only on the eve of the session of the open-ended working group, we consider it as a continuum. So we go on publishing articles in the context of Elder Abuse Day, in the context of IDOP, International Day of Older Persons. Whenever things happen, we just see that opportunity and write regularly, almost every week. See here, the human rights of older persons must be fully protected. And we mention our pertinence, our affiliation with organizations like GAROP. Why? Because GAROP has provided us with tools. And this is what we want other NGOs across the globe to do. This is another article published in 2019. Dis-moi, redouble d'efforts pour l'avènement d'une convention. You see, we keep on hammering, if you allow me this word, that a convention is crucial, that a convention, it is time for a convention. Now, see another press article here. What we did, we got somebody, the former Chief Justice of Mauritius, who is an AU commissioner. We got him on our panel. We got him in our multi-stakeholder meeting to vouch, to speak, to add force to our voice. And this is what we did. Now, I'll show you a last, because a last press article. This is going to the outreaching the older people in their, well, in their contact, wherever they are. Now, with regards to, this is the written press. We have been on television, intervening half an hour, 1 hour, on radio stations. We are using our Facebook pages and our website. We have produced video clips, and the last video clip, music, sending the message. We produced it on the occasion of the 10th, on the 10th of December. And fortunately, that was sponsored by the UN Regional Office in Mauritius. And it is, we have placed it on YouTube. Now, the weeks preceding the 11th Open-Ended Working Group session, we have written already, we have written to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to the different ministries, because we have to talk to them, we have to convince them. Twice you have been going to the sessions, you have taken a very good position. We have congratulated you. Give us the opportunity again to go in the same direction, to congratulate you again, because we are partners. We are the voices of the people. We are telling you what the people are expecting from us. Now, the tools that we have been using have been provided by GAROP. See, I'll invite our fellow NGOs to go on the website of GAROP. Join us to work with us in our working groups and in our technical group. One last thing, Kiran, which I would like to show on this. These are the pamphlets that we have been producing year after year, distributing them at marketplaces. So in summary, I'm going to tell you that 10 mois, we have been animating social life all throughout the years. And this is what we are going to repeat, because the formula has worked, it has given good results, and why change the game? So we are going to maintain it, and we'll hopefully we are going to be able to say that this year again, Mauritius has positioned itself in favor of the Convention for the Rights of Older Persons. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry I took a few minutes, additional minutes. Thank you.
That's okay, Vijay. Thank you very much. You're a master at this, and we really enjoy listening to you, but also benefit from the amazing work you do, both in Mauritius, but in many other places as well. If it's okay with all three of you, I'll address questions to each of you separately. The first two kind of go back to the convention, and perhaps either Amal or Craig can take this. The questions are, how can you ensure that the convention will have a rapid impact on national legislation? And I'll tie a couple of other questions to it. Is the convention based on consensus, or is it a majority voting process for actually getting the convention? Either Amal or Craig.
Definitely Craig, and I have my pencil and I'll be taking notes just as everybody else. So Craig, please.
No, you don't need to have consensus. You just need a critical mass of states who will support the adoption of the convention. But we're very far away from what we need at this stage. So, full-blown advocacy across the board. Amal mentioned something interesting in the politics of this particular process, which is that it really was catalyzed by a number of Latin American states who played a very leading role. And the struggle over the course of the last decade has been trying to expand that constituency of states more, across Africa and Asia in particular. But of course, real resistance from the West, some states in the Western group. So really, we need to build a lot more political support for the convention before we get to the point of adoption of the convention. The second question, once the convention is adopted, and then it needs to be, of course, ratified by individual member states, and then they are obliged to make it a part of their national law. And so that means that it's not just a statement of principles, but that they will then have a legal obligation to give effect to the provisions of the convention in national law, policy, programs, budgets, public education, across the board. Those obligations would show themselves. And those obligations would be monitored, because these treaties typically have a treaty body, a committee of experts established, independent of member states, whose job it is to engage with each state party and to monitor the degree to which they're implementing their concrete obligations under that treaty. So yes, those treaties, once adopted and ratified, do change not just law, but policy and reality on the ground as well.
There's a couple of questions here, and I'm going to put them together. They're somewhat separate, but really address a similar issue. So one is from Kenya, and it says in Kenya, most older people are responsible, the responsibility of their family. What difference would a convention make? And where the state expects people to take care of their old people themselves. Has this been considered, and would there be an answer to that? And on the other end of the spectrum, there's a question from Turkey. Someone from Turkey has asked that they are desperate to have a tool like a convention, because there's so much discrimination and during the lockdown particularly. So can you take both of those and address them together, if that's possible?
Yeah, thank you, Kiran. I can get started if you like. The question of family and then, a convention. I think when one should think of these, one should think of sort of examples and realities on the ground to get a better sense of things. What if older people have family members that are taking good care of them and everything is wonderful? That's fantastic. I mean, rights come in to take care of situations when things aren't fantastic. What if there are family members that are not treating older people well? What's to protect those people? What if older people don't have family members? Many are not having kids or living alone. What about them when families aren't available? And families are burdened now with so many other things. And in many situations, it's older people that are taking care of their adult children and their grandchildren. So it goes in both directions. And also, most importantly, what do old people want? Does anyone bother to ask them? That, I know a lot of older people that don't want to necessarily live with their family. So you need both. You need that social context, but you also need rights. They complement each other. They work together. We know this for other social groups. There are no questions asked there. For Turkey, and I've posted in the chat box who the core countries are, because I had one of them wrong. From the Asia, it wasn't the Philippines, it was Turkey. So this is a great opportunity to try and reach out at the national level particularly. And remember, this working group is part of the General Assembly, and the president of the General Assembly is from Turkey. They're members of the group of Friends of Older Persons in New York. And they're one of the core member states that got that 146 signatories. So anything that you guys can do at the country level to re-engage Turkey in this session, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a question about, dear Amal, would it be possible to call on the governments that independent NGOs, not only Ngos, be consulted during the preparation process for the convention?
I'm sorry, can you say that again, please, Kiran? I don't understand the question.
Yeah, so it says, would it be possible to call on the governments that independent NGOs, not only GONGOS, be consulted during the preparation process for the convention?
I'm not clear on the question, but if it's about Is it about the pre-selection for a number of civil society to come in? I mean, if that's the case, then you know, we will be reaching out to the chairs of the NGO committees on aging in New York, Vienna, and Geneva, to the stakeholder group on aging in Africa, and to GAROP. To be confirmed if this is the path that we're going to take. And then we leave it in your hands to discuss with each other. If this is about the nomination of panelists, then yes, there will be panelists nominated by governments and also by civil society. So please share that information with us so that we can put it in. And if it's about panelists, you know, we will be certain to let the Bureau know that we would like to see, you know, gender balance, geographic distribution, and multiple expertise and perspectives during these panel discussions. Sorry, I hope I addressed the question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Imelda. We'll do this fairly rapid fire sequence because we're going to run out of time soon. This is from Cynthia Stewart for Craig. How on board are the NHRIs in terms of helping us advocate for older people?
The answer to that is very on board. They've played an absolutely critical role, these independent national human rights institutions across the globe. And they're really, they sit in a particular way. They are independent, but they are official institutions that have certain levels of access to government, certain amount of influence, and so on. They have capacity for monitoring relationships with older persons in the community and so on. So they are well positioned to play a very catalytic role, and more of them have been stepping up to play that role in recent years. So absolutely essential.
Yeah, and just to add on that really quickly, they have a very nice representation across different regions. You see them in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America. So collaborate with colleagues at NHRI, reach out to Rio and I to put you guys together. And remember, the only intergovernmental body in the General Assembly in New York so far that allows NHRIs to participate in is the working group. So this is just to add on what Craig was saying, the very, very important role they will play in this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. Erica Dar just posted this for the previous question. She says independent NGOs are not members of Congo and should join GAROP. So just if that helps. Now I'm going to throw this open to all three of you, and Vijay, please feel free to jump in. What have we done wrong for the past decade that we're not able to get a convention for all the people? And we'll finish with that. So we'll spend the last few minutes on Amal, do you want to start off? Oh, can someone mute? There's some. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dr. Kiran. Well, I can't talk for others. I can speak to myself. And last year was the year that the Secretary General asked us to reflect on our work. And frankly, I found that us as Secretariat, I mean, did some mistakes, right? As I said, the conversations inside the working group to me sound very similar to the conversations that I hear at the Commission for Social Development. That's not correct, right? So as substantive agencies, we're trying our best to up the quality of the work so that it's much more of an obligation, redress, you know, that kind of human rights language. And that's why I ask colleagues to do your homework and prepare your interventions so that they're very, very human rights oriented, so that delegations will look at what's happening and hopefully say, oops, we better get in our human rights experts on this, and not the delegates that deal with social development issues. And also, I think it's important to call things what they really are. I know this is often referred to as the open-ended working group on aging, but you will not hear me say that. And when I looked at the history of it, I heard that it was Tessa's fault. So sorry if that was the case. But when you look at the resolution that established it, it's a working group of the General Assembly that's to strengthen the rights of older persons. So let's start calling things what they really are, you know, to set the direction of the conversation where it ought to go. Thank you.
Hi, Kiran. Hi, Kiran.
Yeah, go ahead, Vijay. Please go ahead.
Yeah. You know, there's a question addressed to me with regards to. Can you see this?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. If you can see it, it's good. Now, there's a question addressed to me. What can NGOs do, CSOs do for the ratification of this convention? You know, this convention was adopted by the head of states of the AU in January 2016. We have reached January and gone over it, 21. As of now, only 14 or 15 countries have signed, 2 have ratified, and only 2 have deposited, which means that there is an urgency, there is, you know, an obligation for countries, member states of the AU, who have adopted, for them to start signing it, because it has taken time. Now, what NGOs could do, this is what we have been doing in Mauritius, GMOA, ourselves, in parallel to convincing government to go ahead with the convention, to take a position in favor of the UN Convention. We have asked government in several debates, conversations, seminars, and workshops in the presence of delegates from the AU commissioners to take a stand. And last year, the Minister of Foreign Affairs said that the government is going to sign the protocol. Well, this is, you know, this is the first step. You sign, then you ratify, then you have to domesticate it. It takes time. So this is why I've been saying to my colleagues everywhere that why don't we start thinking about drafting the text of the convention? We are going on the 11th session now. It is time that we started thinking about drafting that convention. If I'm not too fast, maybe Amal would advise on this.
Thank you, Vijay. We're kind of running a little tight on time. So we'll come back to Amal and Craig. Craig, would you like to just finish off this conversation that Vijay has brought up, and also why we haven't got the convention yet? It's been 10 years. And what have we done wrong? Can you tie those 3 things together?
I don't think Vijay is being too fast at all. I think it's time to put pen to paper. There's no question about it. You know, it's late. It's late, and it's time to put pen to paper. I mean, I think if we've done anything wrong at all, the collective, you know, all of the arguments of the past 10 years that have been put forward by opponents to the convention, that ageism is not a particular problem, that older persons are a protected and safe and flourishing group, that there's no normative gap, that there's no protection gap, all of those have been utterly disproven just in the course of the last year. And I think we were a little bit, for all of that time, we have been too quiet. We've been too deferential. We've been too patient. And I really think now it's time to raise a little hell. I think, honestly, it's time to make a righteous noise because while we are looking at diplomacy and law and intergovernmental negotiations, we shouldn't forget that this is really about politics. This is about getting governments to do what they may not want to do. They may not want to invest the money and the effort and everything that goes into it, but we know the need is there, and we need to start really insisting on that. And that needs to happen at the international level in engagement with the working group and in bilateral and multilateral discussions with member states. But it also needs to happen, as I said before, at the level of capitals. States need to feel the pressure to change their position in New York in order to support progress toward a convention, and as Vijay says, to start putting pen to paper. So no more quiet, deferential waiting. I think this is now the moment at which we need to make a righteous noise and push this thing forward.
Thank you very much, Craig. So I'm getting signals now that we need to wrap up. So I really appreciate your last comments that you've made, both Vijay, Amal, and Craig. So just I'll wrap up. I know there's about half a dozen questions that we haven't been able to get to, and I hope that we can address those offline. We've now seen the voice of civil society and older people in making a difference in this process and convincing your governments to support this convention. And again, Craig and Amal and Vijay have done an amazing job of bringing that to light today. my call to action to each and every person on the call today is to go and take this conversation forward in your own countries over the next few weeks. Seek to connect with the human rights experts, with older people and government representatives to discuss this and to better understand how to protect the rights of older people. You can check the Global Alliance website for more information, check the UN websites for more information, and for specific tools that Vijay and others have talked about today. A huge thank you today to all of our speakers, Craig, Amal, and Vijay, as well as to IFA and to Alan. Andra, you've done an amazing job. If I could clap and we could have a very loud standing ovation to all of you today. So thank you very much. And finally, there is our second webinar on this series will be 2 weeks from today. I think it's on the 24th. The time will be a little bit different. It'll be, I think, a couple of hours earlier. So we'll see the notices for that. So I will bring this webinar to a close today once again. Thank you all. I'm very grateful for this discussion and for the talk. Have a great day.
Thank you, Kiran. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.